It's been a while. So I'll just introduce Eric for those who don't know him. Eric is an interdisciplinary maritime experimental archaeologist and a historian, and his interests are throughout the Indian Ocean, shipbuilding, seafaring, and navigation. Now he's been especially busy in things like the experimental vessel reconstruction, and he's been involved in the construction of 11 different maritime experimental reconstructions to date, 12 soon, eh? So his began much back in the day as a navigator and a documentation manager for the Jewel of Muscat project. Many of you know the project's an amazing one. Read it. It's a stone plank reconstruction of a ship that sailed across the Indian Ocean in 2010. And now, most recently, he's working on another project with the Zayed National Museum Bronze Age boat to build and sail a hypothesized 120 gur. I looked it up, Eric. It's 36 tons merchant vessel from the Bronze Age. And again, Eric he's been involved in numerous other things, as we'll see now in this talk. Research includes maritime landscape documentation, digital mapping of Arabic navigation text, ethnography, lexicography, nautical, and of course, underwater excavation and survey. And Eric is now current head of maritime archaeology at the Department of Culture and Tourism in Abu Dhabi. And it's my great pleasure to, Eric, all up to you. We're all waiting in bated breath. Yeah, really looking
Uh-huh.
forward to this.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julian. One second, let me share my screen. Um, Here. You can see now, yes, I believe.
Eric, could just
Perfect. Yeah.
say if you want to ask questions while you're speaking, they should do so in the chat.
Okay. Excellent. Please go ahead, Mazat. So yes, first of all, thank you for Julian for the kind introduction. Thank you as well to ISA for inviting me. I'm actually pretty honored for the opportunity to talk about something that's very close to my heart, and that's the development of maritime navigation in Arabia and the Indian Ocean. I'd also like to thank everyone for taking time out of their very busy schedules to come and listen as well. So today I'll be talking, as the title obviously suggests, about Ahmad Majid and his works and the principles of navigation. So I'm sure almost all of you are aware of Ahmad Majid, but for those of you that aren't, Ahmad Majid was a professional navigator of the 15th century who spent the vast majority of his life sailing the sort of length and breadth of the Indian Ocean and its tributary seas. Even more importantly, at least from, I would say, our perspective today, he was also a prolific author, particularly by, at least by navigator standards, having written over 40 different works, many of which still exist today. Now, I'd like to talk, sort of breaking down the talk into sort of three different parts. First, I'd like to talk about his life and his works, then move on to sort of the principles of Indian Ocean navigation that we find, looking at his works, and then talk about recent trends in the field to try and better understand the compositions of Ibn Majid. So, Ahmad Majid, what I find so interesting about him is that although we know a fair amount about him professionally, where he sailed, a fair amount of advice on navigational techniques and practices and routes, we actually know very little about him personally. His birth and his death are not known. You will see a wide range, everywhere from 1421 to 1437, for when he was first born. This is because our first confirmed date of his life is actually 1462 or 866 Hijriya, when dated one of his major poems, Khawiyat al-Ikhtisar. And the first scholars to study his work, at least academically in the 20th century, Gabriel Farrand, estimated that he must have been probably around 30 years old, at least 30, perhaps as young as 25 years old, when he wrote this. And so you often see a date of 1432. However, later scholars, in particular Ibrahim Khouri, a Lebanese scholar who's worked by far the most on Ahmad Majid, thinks he was actually born earlier, around 1421, in the 1420s, so to speak. But we're not sure. His death is also not known. We have a poem, Mukhammisa in 1500, or that's dated at 1500. It's his last one. And it's pretty apparent by then that he was very old by then. But we don't know how much longer he lived until after that. But we do know it's basically his life encompassed, particularly professional life, the second half of the 15th century. In terms of where he was born, there have been different theories, but most scholars agree with the assumption that he was originally from Jufar, which is modern-day Ras Al Khaimah. And this is based on a reference in a mid-16th century navigational text by the Ottoman admiral Sidi Çelebi, who was making a compendium of the different works of the Indian Ocean navigational works, including Ahmad Majid's. And he said Ahmad Majid, who was from Jufar. He also references that the first Hawiyat al-Ikhtisar, his first large significant poem, was actually written there as well. Almost all scholars today believe that he was originally from Jafar. He comes from a family of navigators, that we are aware. He does reference both his grandfather, Muhammad, and his father, Majid, were also navigators. And he's particularly grateful to his father and his poem on sailing in the Red Sea, which he found to be very educational. But beyond that, we know almost nothing about the rest of his family. There is a very brief reference to a wife that he had in Mecca, who he said he rarely saw because he was always at sea. But that's the only reference that we actually have. So we actually know very little about him, other than the fact that he did sail almost everywhere in the Indian Ocean at some point in the 15th century. There is one thing that I think he's also very well known for, and that is what I refer to as the Portuguese question. And this is a story, or let me say, an account of that Ibn Majid was the navigator that showed Vasco da Gama the way from East Africa to India. Now, this account, when it was basically when scholars first started discovering his work in European archives in the 20th century, they also found a reference in Qutb ad-Din Nahrawali's work about the Ottoman conquest of Yemen, where he actually refers to Ahmad Majid in the mid-16th century, saying that Ahmad Majid was the navigator who got drunk with Vasco da Gama and told him how to sail to India. Ferrand and subsequent scholars actually then took this account. Ferrand was skeptical that he actually got drunk with Vasco da Gama, but otherwise believed that he was the navigator that basically led them across to India. But subsequent generations of scholars have actually questioned that. In large part because Tibbets, for example, who's sort of the main translator of his Ahmad Majid's main work, pointed out that all of the Portuguese documents closest to the actual event of Vasco da Gama's voyage actually mention a navigator who was either a Christian or a Muslim from Gujarat. Ibrahim Khoury, the Lebanese scholar, also argues that he was actually too old in this time period to have actually still been sailing, and that in fact it was another navigator. So it's been largely disproved. What I find interesting, though, is that when I used to teach, I would basically ask my Emirati students about Ahmad Majid, what they knew about him. They all knew him, and I would say over half the students would all mention, "Oh, he showed Vasco da Gama the way to India, but he didn't know what he was doing." So it's a very very alive in, I would say, the popular imagination today, even though it's largely been disproved. Excuse me one second. Now his works. Now, I think actually before I get into his work, I would say the other assumption that I often read, say, for example, on websites about Ahmad Majid, was that he was the professor, the teacher of the other the main Arab navigator that we have texts from this time period, a Yemeni navigator by the name of Sulayman al-Mahri. Sulayman al-Mahri does mention Ahmad ibn Majid in his texts, all of which were written in the first half of the 16th century, but there's no evidence that he actually knew him or personally studied under him. And in particular, because their writing styles are very different, the fields that they focus on are very different, it's very likely that they didn't, in fact, study under one another. But they are still related, and they are both, I would say, equally invaluable for an understanding of navigation in this time period. And I would say it's not his Ahmad Majid's life or his deeds per se, but his works that are his true contribution to history. In particular, because they provide us with the earliest detailed look at the science of navigating the Indian Ocean in the 15th century. There are earlier works, but they are much less detailed, much more vague. This is the first substantial work where there is considerable technical detail. Now, his works, as I mentioned, there's over 40, it's 41. We have at least 32 in 12 different archives throughout the world. The most famous of his is actually Kitab al-Fawaid fi Usul Ilm al-Bahar wal-Qawaid, the book on the benefits and the principles and rules of navigation, as it's often translated, which is his longest work. It's his most comprehensive. And it was written in 1489, towards the latter end of his career, it's considered, where he sort of goes into great depth detailing sort of the main fields and divided into 12 different chapters. What I find really interesting, actually, about this work is that, particularly because it is by far the one that's the most studied today and the one that has the most translations and the one that's cited the most, it is the exception to his work. It's the only work that's written in prose. All the rest are actually written in Rajaz meter, well, in poems and mostly in the Rajaz meter. Now, they vary. Some of them, like this one, Hawiyat al-Ikhtisar fi Usul Ilm al-Bahar, an abridged composition of the principles of knowledge of the seas, is is his longest work. It's 1,082 verses in its most complete version. It's also his earliest work. But he also has much shorter of just a few verses specifying how to navigate using 2 different stars, for example. Others are longer, like the Sufaliyah, which he describes basically how to sail down to East Africa and back. So he has a full range of poems. And I believe the main reason the vast majority of his work is poetic in nature is because it is a very effective way of transmission of knowledge in this time period. If you think, many seafarers, many sailors, and quite a few navigators were not literate. And it was much easier to actually orally memorize and recite this poetry than it was to memorize the entire Kitab al-Fawaid, which we can see here. Now, what I've had the great pleasure and misfortune to have worked with these texts for quite a while, and they are wonderful and also incredibly challenging and frustrating. They're wonderful because there is such a wealth of information. And they are frustrating because there is so much a wealth of information that you often cannot understand or unlock. There have been some excellent translations, but even within those translations, there's a lot of very technical language that's not always well understood today. There are a variety of star names. There's obscure passages. There is a lot that is assumed that the navigator or the reader would know in a 15th century seafaring context that is no longer available to us today. And there is complete, what I would say, incomplete information, if not information that's completely lacking. Say, for example, one I think that particularly is striking to me is in those over 32 works that we have, there's almost no reference to navigating using the sun. Almost all of the references to navigating, when they do use celestial bodies, are stars at night. So it's assumed that the navigator would obviously know how to navigate by day, and so it's not even mentioned. And this is in remarked contrast to, say, European navigation, which is much more solar-based. That being said, these texts are provide a lot of information and give us, I would say, a relatively good picture of navigational science in late medieval Indian Ocean. Now, there is the debate on whether you use the word art, use the word science. I would say that it is a combination of both. And what it is what I would say a complex field or a complex set of practices and bodies of knowledge, which are then integrated by a community to try and find their way across often very difficult and challenging bodies of water. Now, some of the fields of navigation that sort of together make this complex science are the four that I'm listing here. Now, there are more. I don't have time to talk about all of them, but I think it's worth discussing these just to give you an idea of sort of the basics of what Ahmad Majid talks about when he describes navigating across the Indian Ocean. So the first is natural wayfinding. Now, this is, I would say, it's not discussed a lot in the text, but I would say this is the way that actually the vast majority of people navigate for all of human history, including ourselves. I would say that most of us did not use a GPS to get to where we are today. We are familiar with our houses, our office buildings, our neighborhoods, etc. We know where to turn left, when to turn right, when to go up the stairs, etc. And at the sea, sailing on the sea is in many ways very similar, particularly if you have a coastline. There's also sailing season and dates, the mawāsim, which just means seasons in Arabic, which had a particular meaning within the navigational context. Then we have the stellar compass rose, or the stellar rose, as we often refer to it, the akhnān, and star altitude measurement. All right. So what I'm going to do is just sort of briefly go through those four just to give you sort of an idea of what we're looking at within the text and how they would actually sail across different bodies of water. Now, I put the most obvious form, the isharat, which just means signs in Arabic. But the isharat encompass a wide variety of all the natural features of a marine and coastal environment that navigators could use to find out where they were. There's references to birds, for example, different types of birds marking different locations, particularly in East Africa. You had coastal landmarks, which were also very useful for when you're doing coastal sailing, coastal routes along the way, prominent capes, prominent features along the coast. There's a large amount of literature talking about the mawāris, a particular type of snake that's found off the western seaboard of India, as used as sort of a marker of location, but also mentioning different types of silt, depths, etc. Basically, almost anything could be used for signs for making a way across the sea. But like I said, this was perhaps the majority of the way in which navigators used, particularly because they would usually start sailing at a very young age, sometimes as young as 7. So they were relatively familiar with the environments in which they were sailing the majority of the time. But they also relied on other aspects for making their way across the seas. Now, as I'm sure you're all very aware, that any book on Indian Ocean history always starts with a very Brodelian discussion of the environment and the monsoons and the eastern monsoons, the Azyab, which blow from the northeast in the winter, combined with the southwest monsoons, that are much stronger in the summer months. But what is very interesting is when you start to, and that there is an inherent truth to this, but within this sort of relatively what I would say reductionist narrative, there is a complex array of windscapes that change according not only to frequency, but direction and strength throughout the year. And all of this is incredibly important. This knowledge is incredibly important if you are on a sailing ship, which they were. So what they did in the navigators in the time of the medieval period was had in the mawāsim. Mawāsim just means monsoon or season, but mawāsim in the navigational context of these texts actually refers to specific dates when you could and could not sail. Now this is from Tibbet's work, Arab Navigation, before the coming of the Portuguese. And they actually would say, okay, this is when you can sail from one port to another, and this is when you can sail, or you shouldn't sail from this on these days. Now they wouldn't use the Islamic calendar, the Hijriya, because it was a lunar calendar and it changed too much year by year, 10 to 11 days per year. Instead, they relied on the year's Girdian Nayruzi calendar. And they didn't break it into months, it was just a day system. So it was day 1 to day 365. And so you can see here on this chapter, and they slightly changed because it wasn't sort of it was 1 day difference every 4 years. There was a slight differences between Sulayman, al-Mahri in the 16th century is Ahmad Majid. But what we can see here, say for example, if you're sailing from Aden to Gujarat, for example, you would want to leave on the 170th to the 180th day of Nairuz, which is May 11th to May 12th. However, going Muscat to Malabar, to Kerala, you would be going on the 90th to the 140th day, February 20th to April 11th. And what this is basically, these numbers represent generations of testing by navigators of all the times when it was safe or the most efficient and safest times to actually make their ways from a wide variety of different ports, as you can see here. So Isharat sort of provides sort of a general environmental markers to sort of guide you on your way in general, particularly for coastal navigation. The mawāsim provide you a schedule, a timeline, something to pay attention to, when to sail and when not to sail. The Stella Rose, the akhnān, the khan or the hin, it's spelled differently depending on which source, is a method of direction using the rising and setting of stars, 16 stars to be exact. So what we can see here is this is on a compass rose card that my colleague Alessandro Gadoni very kindly drew up here, where you can see sort of the North Star is the pole star, al-Jah or Yah, but all the rest are actually risings and settings. So northeast was not northeast, it was Matla al-Ayuk, the rising of Capella. And northwest was not northwest, but Mughib al-Ayuk, the setting of Capella. And this was their way of basically of sort of finding direction. Now, these stars are chosen because they are prominent, bright, and visible, not because of their accuracy. They should be considered sort of zones within a belt rather than exact points on the horizon. That being said, they are considerably accurate. Now, at the time of Ibn Majid, there was the mariner's compass, water compass, and there is considerable descriptions in Ibn Majid of the use of the compass. And they took this system of direction, which was existed prior to the integration of the compass, and then sort of integrate it within the compass to use it. Now, I always want to qualify when we talk about a compass in the 15th century context. It's not the compass of today. They had not figured out the problems of magnetic declination. There was often serious defects with it as well. So the compass was useful, but in some ways, and in many ways, the stars were actually more accurate when they were visible. When they were not visible, the compass was then a very good guide for it. And you can see here, this is some of the different stars. This is from Hassan Salah Shahab's article here. And this just gives you all the different stars that are used. Oh, and south, due south was not a star because it doesn't mark a pole, but it was Canopus at its culmination, basically marked due south as well here, as you can see. So this gives, so again, we have sort of the signposts on the coast and the natural environment. We have the times when and when not to sail. We have direction. But in terms of positioning, of how they determined, particularly when they were sailing out of sight of land, trying to figure out where exactly in this vast body of ocean they actually were. This is where they relied on star altitude measurements. Qiyās, again in Arabic, just means measuring. But in these texts refers to a very specific and technical practice. Now, the entire, what I would call field of qiyās, of star altitude measurements, is based on the fundamental fact that the pole star, Polaris, today, or in the last 2,000 years, is basically relatively fixed. It moves a bit, but it's relatively fixed on the northern horizon. And the farther north you go, the higher in the sky it is. The farther south you go, the closer to the horizon it is. So navigators learned that if you measured the height of the pole star from the horizon on the sea, then you could actually determine your approximate latitude. Now, what I found interesting in these texts, Ibn Majid was a very literate and well-read man, and he actually was very familiar with astronomical texts, and he was familiar with astronomical instruments, and he was familiar with the practice of astronomers measuring stars in degrees. He'll even provide them every once in a while. But all of his recommendations and all of his advice for navigators, sailors, gives measurements in terms of fingers, not degrees. And this is deliberate. And this is based off the practice of well, basically extending your hand out like this, putting the bottom of your hand on the horizon, and then counting how many fingers high the star was actually. So thus, for example, Socotra was 5 fingers high. Ras al-Had, 10.5 fingers high. Sri Lanka, down to 1 to 2 fingers high. So what you can see here is that and then if you go below Sri Lanka, the pole star disappears, and they would use a different set of stars, the guardians, and then the plow. The farther south they would go. Now, by Ibn Majid's times, it was apparent that they were not using hands, because obviously some people have bigger hands, longer arms, etc. There's a lot of variation. So to standardize, they would have wooden instruments, which are referred to in the text as khashabat, pieces of wood. Now, this is what they're commonly attributed to look like, often referred to as a kamal, largely based off James Prinsep's drawing and documentation in the 1830s of Arab navigators using a relatively simple piece of wood like this, with strings, with knots on the string right there that you can see, marking different ports in different places and locations. And thus, what you can see here is that by, even if you were sailing and you couldn't see, say, for example, you're sailing from Kulum, Mali, on the southern Indian coast to Socotra, you would keep sailing sort of in a northwest or west-northwest direction, measuring the height of the pole star until it was 5 fingers. And then you would know you head direct west. This is sort of the concept of latitude sailing. Now, it's particularly well suited to the Indian Ocean because the pole star is close enough to the horizon that you can measure it. Almost all of these are 12 fingers or less. Say in Northern Europe, it's much more difficult. And it's also well suited for latitude sailing in the sense that if you sail east or west, as you can see from this map, you will run into a coast at some point, even if you do get profoundly lost. Whereas if you sailed south, you would be going a very long way till Antarctica. This gives you an idea. So what, and I think before I jump to that, collectively, you can see there are different aspects that are being used and that are reflected in the texts of Ibn Majid and Sulayman al-Mahri. Our navigators are trying to use celestial information, seasonal information, and sort of natural environment information to sort of make their way. And then they would then sort of take all this information and put them collectively into a description of routes. So the navigator would often have much of this information when they were actually sailing from one port to another. Now, I would like to spend a little bit of the rest of the talk just talking about recent trends in the field to try and better understand this practice, because I've tried to explain it as simply as possible. But when you actually read the text, it's not always this simple, and there are still quite a few questions that we have people such as myself are when they're working through these texts. And there are new techniques or different techniques that have come up to try and better understand, to try to decipher the problematic passages, for example, such as voyaging experiments or digital celestial reconstruction. There's also new manuscripts which have been found, which is rather exciting, which is sort of further deepening our textual corpus of his work. And then I think there's also been an effort by scholars in the last couple, 2-3 decades to create a broader contextualization of his work. So I'll talk about each one sort of individually. And yes, I will talk about the Jewel Muscat project here. Largely because we had this wonderful opportunity with the Jewel Muscat to experiment with this navigation. So for those of you that aren't aware, the Jewel Muscat project, which was my first experimental archaeological project, was a reconstruction, an attempt to reconstruct a 9th century stone plank ship. You can see it here being built. And the shipwreck itself was found off Belitung Island in Indonesia, carrying an incredible cargo of ceramics and other priceless artifacts. But the hull itself, there was a remarkable degree of it which was still available. Unfortunately, it was salvaged, not excavated, but we still had a reasonable amount of information to which based the reconstruction, which you can see here. All of it was sewn together with coconut fiber. No nails were used. Over 37,000 holes in total. Now, the vessel itself was 9th century. Unfortunately, we do have the Akhbar al-Sin wal-Hind, which is a travel account that sort of describes the sailing route from the Gulf to China, but it doesn't give us much detail. When we made the route, this was a 5-month voyage in 2010 from Muscat to Cochin to Sri Lanka over to Malaysia, Penang, Klang, and then down to Singapore. It was a wonderful opportunity to experiment with the navigational practices that we see in the text of Ahmad and Majid. And we actually brought the text along with us, the actual manuscript copies of Kitab al-Fawaid and one of Sulayman al-Mahri's works, as well as the translations, or the translation, Tibbet's translation as well. And what was great, one of the many things about this voyage was just the full range of conditions. We were becalmed for days, as you can see here, with not a breath of wind, making almost zero movement. At other times, such as across the Bay of Bengal, we actually sailed through the edge of a cyclone, which I don't recommend. But what this did basically was give us a wonderful opportunity to sort of try and reconstruct how a navigator would use all of these techniques when making their way across the Indian Ocean. So we did a series of navigational experiments every night with the team. You can see Captain Salah here with the Kamal rope in his mouth, as well as many of the crew members. And we tried to take measurements, particularly with qiyās, the star altitude measurements. We were trying to make measurements every night, whenever we could, about 3 to 4 individuals. One of the first things we did, this is on the very first leg, 1 month from Muscat down to Cochin, was when we were experimenting with the instruments, is that the instruments didn't seem to match the text very well. They were difficult to calibrate. The method, the type of Kamal, and this is one, we made several different of this variety. the finger measurements were difficult to actually document correctly with the knots. And so when we arrived in Cochin, we designed our alternative reconstruction based on what we thought was being described in the text of Ibn Majid. And then used this, sort of, as you can see, a pair of wooden hands. They make references to anywhere small, medium, and large khashaba. Then there's another description of 9 different ones with different fingers. So we have some different descriptions. We started using these, and they were much more effective, we found at least, for our qiyās measurements. What I also found very interesting with this experimentation was that I had been reading Ahmad Majid's text prior to this in graduate school, and I had always found it very difficult, very obtuse, hard to understand. During this voyage, the texts honestly came alive in a way that I had not anticipated. As we started to connect the dots, so to speak, this star was connected to that star, and this is what they were talking. And sort of all of a sudden we realized how much, when you read these texts in the environment in which they're meant to be read and used, they make much more sense. A relatively simple concept, but one that I found to be very educational on this. What was also very interesting, and something that I hadn't, or even I think most scholars had read about it, was when you actually try to apply these star altitude measurements at sea, Ahmad Majid has 73 different star combinations. So there's a pole star, but often you don't see the pole star. The Bay of Bengal, when we sailed, 19 days voyage, we only saw the pole star twice in 19 days. So we had to rely on a whole other set of other star combinations to try and extrapolate the height of the pole star to give us latitude. And so Ahmad Majid has 73 different combinations, which I'd always thought was him, to be honest, showing off, trying to impress people. But when I was in Sri Lanka going through the list, trying to actually figure out which ones we could use, there was only a handful that were actually usable within that latitude at that time of year where the stars were visible that we could actually use. And then when we sailed, made the passage across the Bay of Bengal and were through the cyclone, we couldn't see the entire northern horizon. We could only see a southern glimpse. So we actually only used 2 or 3 of those combinations for almost the entire passage of 19 days. And what I started to realize was just the complexity that is built into these texts. It has a purpose, and it's to give navigators in these types of situations a wide variety of different methods of doing this, of finding their way at sea. But unfortunately, we don't have opportunities to sail medieval reconstructed vessels across the Indian Ocean every day. I'm still waiting for the next opportunity. But in the meantime, digital celestial reconstruction has been incredibly helpful for helping to decipher these texts. In particular, Stellarium software program, which is free, and which has this wonderful feature where you can actually, it's historic celestial reconstruction. So you put in a date and a location, and it will basically reconstruct the sky, how it looked, say, for example, in 1489, when Kitab al-Fuad was written, for example. And this means that you can then use it to try to reconstruct things that are basically described in the text. Now, I put this here just as an example. This is a Mukhamisa of Ahmad Majid's in the Omani manuscript. And it's basically, it's not a very long one, and it's just talking about how to measure 2 stars, Fuad al-Asad, which is Korkoroli, and Baqt al-Hut, which is Maraj, basically at the same time to give you your approximate latitude. You can see here, the belly is the belly of the whale, a radiant star, the mansions of the moon of which there are signs. It is not necessary for me to describe it to the skilled navigator. The 2 of them, meaning Korkoroli and Maraj, are 5 at the backside of Mami Socotra. Receive in full this knowledge and acknowledge it as a gift from me. Now measure them in a single star altitude measurement. The decreased amount is half a tarfa, which we think is a finger, or we approximate as a finger, and check, as well as the added amount. Understand the principles. The 2 of them are no more than 6 at Sajr, and at Nasr, 4 fingers. So do it. And so hopefully this gives you an idea of what I mean when it's sometimes slightly obscure when it's text here. You're reading this going, okay, it's Socotra. We know the stars, but what exactly is he talking about? And how does this translate? He says, oh, they're at 5 fingers, basically, at Mami Socotra, which is wonderful. But how does that translate to the pole star latitude measurement? And how do you use these? And when do you use these? And you can see here, this is Tibet's map of Mami Socotra, which is sort of the eastern cape of Socotra. You can see there. You see Sajr up on the southern Arabian coast as well, in the central part as well. So we've got 2 locational reference points, which we can then use. So you put this information into Stellarium, you put the location, you put the date of the approximate poem, you then look at the approximate the stars and you track them until their altitude is exactly the same. And then you come up with, oh, when their altitude is exactly 8 degrees and 47 minutes high, it happens to be 10:35 in the evening on January 11th in 1480, they are actually, that's at approximately 5 fingers. It gives you a finger value that you can approximate in terms of degrees. And then you measure the pole star at the same time, which is also approximately 5 fingers as well. And that's when he says 5 fingers, and he says 5 in that description in the poem. We know that Mami Socotra is 5 fingers, but we didn't know if these stars are 5 fingers or if Polaris is 5 fingers. So this actually then it sort of clarifies the whole situation. You can then do the same with Sajr as well, which is wonderful, and then gives you, and you can see, oh, Polaris is 7 fingers, but they're 6. So every time, basically, it's 2 fingers of Polaris for 1 finger of these 2 stars, because this is not spelled out in any of the text. It's known that it's assumed that the navigator would know this. And so it's been wonderful. I've actually assigned quite a few assignments in my classes when I used to teach to students to sort of digitally reconstruct these different passages from these texts. And some of the students have actually solved debates that Ibrahim Khoury and Tibbets were having. Actually, even last month there was one that solved a star declination. So they are incredibly useful, even for beginning students, as well as for people that have been working with the text for many, many years. Also, there are, and this is wonderful to hear, that there are still new manuscripts that are being found. What was surprising was that in Oxford, actually, there were 3 manuscripts that the main scholars to work on Ibn Majid, Tibbets, and Khoury and Farrand were completely unaware of. They weren't brought to anyone's attention until around 2004. And subsequently, there is the Rutter project, which I'll talk about in a second, is undergoing a critical edition of Kitab al-Fawaid for these particular manuscripts. These are the earliest. One of them is dated to 1489. So these are earliest manuscripts we have, which is incredibly invaluable because much of the manuscripts are quite a bit later in terms of their when they were actually transcribed. And also another new manuscript of a new work of Ibn Majid's in Egypt as well. And all of this can be found. I highly recommend, if you are interested in this, Rudder technical notes. They're free, they're online. The Rudder project was a project based in the University of Lisbon on navigation in the early modern period in a global context. And Juan Acevedo and Anesh Bernard, and with assistance by Julian Muller, were actually working on the Arabic navigational texts and have done some excellent work. And I'll list all of the manuscripts, all of the sources that they found available. It's an annotated bibliography, which I highly recommend. And then finally, a broader contextualization of his work. Now, what I mean by this, there is obviously what I would refer to as a sociological turn in the last several decades in the fields of history and to a lesser extent archaeology, in which scholars are increasingly recognize the importance of oceans, seas, and other bodies of water in shaping and influencing human societies and human behaviors, human bodies of knowledge. What we are also realizing, and say, for example, Tibbet's translation, Arab navigation. What we are realizing, or at least scholars are, this more current generation of scholars are realizing, is that this work, it is written in Arabic. There are Arab navigators. It is fundamentally an Arabic navigational cultural tradition, but it is part of a much larger multicultural and cosmopolitan body of knowledge, which is shared with many other communities and societies on the Indian Ocean. For example, the recent scholarship that's just coming out, we're still waiting for quite a bit more, but on the Gujarati Pothis collection that we have in India from the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries, we see remarkable similarities in many ways with a lot of the texts of Ahmad, a lot of the practices, and even the terminology. We also see reflections in Chinese navigational literature, Chinese stellar diagrams attributed to the 15th century, which actually attribute in this bay, across the Bay of Bengal, the same stars that we used when we sailed on the Jewel Muscat across. And also a deeper understanding of the ways in which this complex science was actually an interactive practice. And what we start to see when you look at Ibn Majid and Sulayman al-Mahri's work is they're actually also referring to navigators from the Cholas dynasty in southern India, for example, or of East Africa. You have Persian terms that are sort of embedded throughout these texts. This is a profoundly multicultural body of knowledge that we have a wonderful lens through with these Arabic texts that we have. So with that, I think I've talked probably too long at this point, but I would like to probably end and just say there is actually still much more to be done with Ibn Majid. His poetry in particular has not been studied to nearly the same depth as Kitab al-Fawaid, other than Hawayat al-Ittisar, which has been translated by Ibrahim Hori. But there is a lot more to be done. There's a lot more to be done with experimented. Very little has been done with Sulayman al-Mahri as well. So it is still, even though it's been, a subject to study for over 100 years, there is still quite a bit to be done. So thank you very much. For those of you that are still here with me, thank you. Yes.
Thank you, Eric. Thank you. That's amazing. I'm sure you could see everyone. No, that's super great. That's great. So I don't see any marks in the chat, so that means I get to ask a few questions here. Excellent.